In this video, I'm going to go over the most underrated and overlooked Pokemon for your Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald Nuzlockes. In case you're new here, I've kind of had a little obsession over the Generation 3 games in the past several months, and as a result, I've played with a ton of different Pokemon, and I have to say, there have been quite a few, even recently, that have pleasantly surprised me. Don't let their looks, poor base stats, and or abilities deceive you, because these encounters have a chance to make your run just a little bit easier to navigate. Let's get into it. Early bug types get a bad rap in every new generation that comes out. Their typing is generally weak, their base stats suck and aren't distributed very well, and they just generally struggle against most content, even sometimes in the earlier parts of the game. In fact, the only help they normally get is the fact that they tend to evolve very early, making them fairly useful in the very beginning of your journey, but then becoming useless as the game goes on. Well, in my experience, Nuzlockes is a little bit different. His base stats may seem low, but he gets the most out of each one, having a much more defensive focus in his overall build. His ability Shield Dust just emphasizes this strength even further, and while both of his attacking stats are pitiful at best, that's not what Nuzlockes is built to do. With the combination of Poison Sting, Protect, and Confusion, the Poison Moth Pokemon becomes really annoying to deal with in the entire first half of the game. And Nuzlockes can make it that far because of how bulky he is compared to the other early bug types. Where Nuzlockes truly shines in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald Nuzlockes is on the 2nd and 5th gym leaders. Nuzlockes practically makes the Brawly fight free, having a 4 times resistance to all of Brawly's attacks, and Confusion to dispose of his entire team. Don't sleep on this gym. Depending on your encounters, this fight is not an easy one to navigate. But it doesn't stop there, because Nuzlockes also plays a major role in the Norman fight as well. Remember that moveset I mentioned earlier in Poison Sting, Protect, and Confusion? Well, that just so happens to be the recipe for success against Norman's Slackings. With Slacking's True-On ability, Nuzlockes can use Protect on their active turns, and then Poison Sting on their off turns. This can be used back and forth until Slacking is poisoned, and then it's just a waiting game from there. Norman is one of the toughest fights in the entire game, regardless of the encounters you've gotten up until that point. So this is extremely useful. And on top of that, Nuzlockes doesn't even need to be at a high level in order to pull that off. It is at this point that Nuzlockes sadly starts to lose more and more value in comparison to the other Pokemon that you can obtain. But the value he can give you up to that point should not be underestimated. I feel like both Solrock and Lunatone have received a fair amount of criticism since they've been introduced into the Generation 3 games. I have been very critical of them as well, placing both Pokemon in the D tier on my Pokemon Emerald tier list. And while I think I still might be able to justify that placement for Lunatone, I can no longer give Solrock the same treatment. I really don't know why I was so hard on Solrock in my tier list video. Maybe it was just because of its typing with a world filled with water and dark types. I don't know, but its stats aren't as bad as I thought they were, and having Levitate as your ability is never a bad thing. It's funny though, because what really changed my mind about Solrock was in fact his typing. Rock is a terrible type for the later parts of the game, but this is a very short-sighted view of the challenges you'll run into with your Nuzlocke. While it's true that Solrock will fall off a cliff once you start navigating through all the water routes after Lily Cove City, some of the toughest boss fights in the entire game occur before that happens. With Solrock's rock typing and early rock throw, it's actually very helpful with dealing with the likes of Flannery, Norman, and Winona, which are again some of the more difficult battles to navigate through in your Nuzlocke. Allow me to formally apologize to the Living Sunstone for underrating its capabilities. Linoone is similar to Nuzlockes in a sense that the early game normal types tend to be overlooked when it comes to deciding how you're going to build your team. But normal types in general can be better than you think, and Linoone is a great example to look at. The normal typing, while not flashy offensively or defensively, is consistent. And consistency is a bigger deal in Nuzlockes than in casual playthroughs, for example. Zigzagoon and Linoone both get a lot of great tools early that maximize their typing. The former gets Stab Headbutt at level 9, which is pretty ridiculous when you think about it. Not only that, but the Silk Scarf is also obtainable extremely early, right after you get your first gym badge in fact. Throw in the fact that this line actually is quite fast, and you've got a decent team member on your hands all of a sudden. Linoone also has a very diverse move pool. He's arguably the game's best HM slave with the ability to learn the 4 major ones in Cut, Rock Smash, Strength, and Surf. But he gets a lot of coverage outside of that as well if you needed it for some reason. And honestly, Pickup is a good ability for Nuzlockes in this generation. Extra potions, balls, rare candies are all very helpful, and will save you a lot of money in the long run, and money is pretty useful in these games. And finally, you can take your Linoon to the Pokemon League if you want with Belly Drum. It can be a little tricky to pull off, I'll admit, but if you can get it to work, all of a sudden Linoon becomes one of the most terrifying offensive forces in the entire game. Sableye is another Pokemon that I heavily underestimated until I actually got to play with him in one of my recent runs. His base stats may be terrible, really terrible, but 3 immunities and 0 weaknesses is not a joke and more than makes up for his pitiful stats. Sableye's typing truly makes him defensively gifted, and Game Freak did give him some pretty useful tools to help you out in your playthrough. Toxic Stalling is a given when you have attributes like this, and that can be paired alongside Confuse Ray, Detect, and Fake Out as well. And honestly, I was sleeping on Nightshade, especially in the first half of the game. When your offensive capabilities just don't exist, Nightshade becomes surprisingly helpful in boss fights. Sableye completely walls Brawly. It's actually very comical to watch his Pokemon struggle. Because of his immunities, not a single attack can get through. A very similar scenario plays out against Norman as well, who we just mentioned being a very tough boss fight in the middle of the game to deal with. Strong against Tate and Liza, and even some of the members of the Elite Four if you're bold enough to bring them along. Overall, while there aren't many fights where Sableye dominates, there are literally 0 in which he is weak. And with all of that being said, I definitely find him to be a very underrated Pokemon. I would not be disappointed if I was able to get him again in a future Nuzlocke. Finally, we end today's video with a pair of Pikachu clones. Plusle and Minun don't look like much at first glance. They are fairly frail, with a below average base stat total, and 2 completely useless abilities for your Gen 3 Nuzlocke. Plus and minus cannot be used because Plusle and Minun share the same singular encounter location, meaning you'll never have both of them on your team. But with that being said, it just so happens that Plusle and Minun are 2 of the best support Pokemon in the entire generation. We're talking Encore, Thunder Wave, and either Charm for Minun or Fake Tears for Plusle. Hell, throw in a Double Team or a Track into the mix if you want to be extremely annoying. There are just so many tools here to utilize, and they're both pretty quick at least, which is exactly what you need to fulfill this type of role. And don't get me wrong, if you need to Thunderbolt something, they are certainly capable of that as well. They may be frail, but they hit harder than you think. Fast electric types in general are decent in any game, but in these games they are significantly better. The Hoenn region is littered with water and flying types just begging to be zapped, and this boosts Plusle and Minun's value very greatly. There's nothing else to say. These 2 are awesome encounters and should not be overlooked or pushed aside. And with that, this video is now over. If you've undervalued any of these Pokemon I've talked about today, I hope you give them another chance in your next Nuzlocke of Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald. In the meantime, please like the video and subscribe for more content like this, and let me know which Pokemon you think are underrated in the Generation 3 games. That's it from me. I'll see you next time.